All right. So this is, as I mentioned, is the final of 5 webinar series. So we had the introduction. Then we talked about some case studies here in Kansas. We also covered nitrogen removal. Last week, Grant covered phosphorus removal. And today we're going to do a review. Again, there are 1.5 CEUs per session. However, because I was out of town last week, I wasn't able to cover anything on chemical phosphorus removal, which can play an important role in removing phosphorus at your plant if biological phosphorus removal either isn't practical or that it has an upset, and then chemical phosphorus removal can serve as a backup. So basic idea here is that there's various metals when it's dissolved in water that will bind to dissolved orthophosphate compounds. And then when they combine, they precipitate out of solution, typically in the plant clarifiers. Chemical phosphorus removal does lead to pretty significant increases in solids production. So if you're considering it and you already are pushing the limits of your solids processing and storage, keep that in mind. It may not be the way to go, or you may need to up your game on that. Chemical phosphorus removal is typically pretty reliable and predictable. There's no toxicity that is going to come about with chemical phosphorus removal. You're not going to run out of BOD or have some other kind of biological upset occur, but it's also pretty expensive, which is why KDHE and Grant and I both tend to focus on biological phosphorus removal if possible. A little bit of basic phosphorus chemistry. Here on the right is dissolved orthophosphate in solution, so that's PO4, as you can see, and any negatively charged has to have an associated positively charged. In your waters, it's going to be sodium, calcium will predominate on that. Phosphorus is coming in primarily dissolved as orthophosphate, and there is some coming in via solids at your plant. Now, I bring up this slide in that detergents, historically used to be pretty large sources of phosphorus. Largely, those have been changed under law and kind of just public pressure. So at the very top here, we have an example of a detergent. So typically it kind of has something that looks like an oil, and that's the carbon hydrogen to the left, and then something that dissolves in water, and that's that sulfate compound there on the right. That looks very similar in structure to dissolved orthophosphate. And the reason this is important is that the metals that are used for binding phosphorus, chemically, will have an affinity to very similar compounds. So if you're thinking about phosphorus removal at your plant with chemicals, it's typically going to be more efficient and effective if you can eliminate the detergents from the water flow before you introduce the chemicals, because there tends to be less efficiency because there's other places for those metal salts to bind. The chemicals that are out there are going to be ferric chloride, aluminum sulfate, and ferret sulfate. Those are kind of the most commonly used that are available, as a commodity product. You can call a few chemical suppliers, get bids, pretty readily available. There are other metal salts that can also be utilized. There's a multitude of polyaluminum chlorides. Anybody who has surface water plants is probably familiar with PAC. The chemistry is very similar to alum, but certain chemicals may work better in your plant than alum, and therefore be cheaper or have some other positive contribution to your operations. You'll also see, if you go to WEFTEC or state level trade shows, companies promoting rare earth compounds. I've been to a couple plants that are using rare earth, and they really like them. But before making the leap with any proprietary chemical compound for phosphorus removal, I very strongly would advocate that you have the company perform jar test to have a good understanding of what kind of dosage you're going to need and what it's going to cost you to remove phosphorus if you're going with a proprietary compound. So when we're looking at kind of the larger nutrient removal in game, there's a couple different theories as to how you can use chemical addition. The first one that you probably want to avoid if possible is having a plant that you have to add chemical in order to be compliant with any phosphorus limitations. If you get really, really tight phosphorus limits, maybe under 0.7, 0.8 milligrams per liter, chemical becomes almost a necessity for phosphorus compliance. But at the limits that are going to be faced by Kansas plants, at least as far as we're aware of at this point, typically biological phosphorus removal is within the realm of usable solutions. Some plants that are in Kansas that are removing phosphorus are using it on an as-needed basis or seasonally. Phosphorus removal, at least in the Kansas context, tends to worsen during the summertime. And Grant and I have some theories, and we could spend all day talking about them on that. You may also have some industrial contributions that give you high phosphorus loadings at times that will overwhelm the biology's ability to remove phosphorus, at which point you would have responsive chemical dosing. But this is probably where a lot of plants are going to end up. So they're going to try and rely on biological phosphorus removal if at all possible, and then have chemical backup. New build plants tend to have chemical dosing equipment in them, but they also have biological phosphorus removal infrastructure as well for new build plants. So that's probably where a lot of facilities that are on this call will end up, that they'll have the ability to dose chemical and hope not to ever have to use that. So we strongly advocate jar testing. I worked under contract with KDHE for several years doing jar testing throughout the state of Kansas at mainly smaller mechanical plants. Why do we need to do jar testing? If you are looking at chemical phosphorus removal, dig up those old reports when I was at your facility, and we can attempt to bring those into modern money, dollar values. But the reason for jar testing is that every wastewater treatment plant has different water, it has different biology, it has different industries, it has different collection systems and different processes. These are two, towards the older end. On the bottom, this is a pretty basic oxidation ditch at Bueller, well maintained, tends to put out pretty good water. And then we have kind of the highest technology plant in the state, which is Dodge City, their north plant. So the reason for jar testing, and I have some graphs coming up, is that selecting the wrong chemical can either lead to non-compliance, which we don't want, or you can spend quite literally tens of thousands of extra dollars that you don't need to. Because for whatever reason, chemical A doesn't work as good as chemical B, and therefore you end up using a lot more of chemical A in your scenario, spending a lot of money that you don't need to spend, probably generating more solids as well. So we used to get a referral from KDHE. We'd look at the DMRs, we'd look at the receiving water body, because one issue with chemical addition is that you're not just adding metal, you're adding metal salt. So if you're adding ferric chloride, for example, you're adding chloride. A lot of the facilities in Kansas are already discharging to chloride impaired streams. We really don't want to add to that salt loading. Likewise, sulfate is often an issue in many Kansas surface water streams. So that's another item to keep in mind and driver to go for biological if at all possible. So we'd add sequentially higher doses and then see what happens with phosphorus levels after mixing. So if you're thinking about chemical addition for phosphorus removal, a few things you need to have is you need to have good mixing downstream of the application. So places like splitter boxes or any place there's a drop in water tend to be pretty good. If you're putting it before your aeration tank, you want to do it as late in the game as possible. So you don't want to dose, your water before bar screen and grit removal, because that's just another place for some of that chemical to bind and not be utilized appropriately. So in facilities, we typically test before the secondary clarifier and also before the biological process in most facilities. So we went to a wide range of plants, and typically we tried to put it a cost to the facility on a per customer, so per connection per month. And the average we got to, and this is 3 or 4 years ago, was $3.57 per customer. Take a look at your current sewer bills. Often they're in the low 20s to low 30s. So that's a pretty significant cost increase, and that's just for the chemical alone, not for the supplies to have dosing and control of it, not for extra solids handling cost either. The highest, by the way, was the city of Ellenwood, and I've worked with them a lot for trying to get biological phosphorus removal going, and it was $8.34 per customer per month. That's really expensive as a percentage of the total sewer bill. All right, wrap up with these graphs. So this is from the city of Derby, not picking on Derby, just kind of the results we got. So we dosed ferric sulfate for their influent. And the cost estimate to bring phosphorus down was $416,000 annual. That's pretty steep. For alum in the influent, we never got the numbers to the numbers that are desired. So you could add as much chemical as you want and you never would get compliance. Then we dosed before the clarifiers at the facility, and ferric sulfate had an estimate of $97,000. And alum was $117,000. So, the jar test, which, at a plant like Derby is going to take pretty much all day, and then I have to run the calculations. That's a $20,000 savings if they're, pick the ferric over the alum at their facility. So probably well worth the juice is worth the squeeze in the case of Derby, particularly if they were going to dose at the effluent for one reason or another. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Grant. I will stop sharing and he can take it from here.
All right, thanks. While I'm booting this up, there was some chat about the November 29th list that you had, and I got to tell you, I'm a little confused too, so maybe you can clarify it. That is not a list, is it, Nick, of everyone that to get certificates? That's a list of people where there's multiple certificates. You're muted right now.
Yeah, if you were on your own, you're recorded. So what we see at the end of the meeting is basically your name and email address and your sign in, sign out time, and then total number of minutes you were participating. So that is recorded for everyone. It doesn't matter if I hit record on this meeting or not. It's the chat recording. So anybody who was in a group, that's what that list was.
All right. Or if you're signed in on your cat's name or something like that, then you might want to clarify that.
Yes.
All right. And then when Nick was talking about the chemical addition for the Nick, for plants that are going to use it to polish or on bad days, I think you would want to add that chemical after the aeration, right? Because if you add it before the aeration, that's going to minimize the biological portion.
Yes. Unless if there's some, like an SBR, you couldn't really do that at. Unless if there's a good reason you would want to add it before clarifiers at most plants. And you would be responsive to that if you either saw your biological process going south for one reason or another, you were monitoring it and it didn't appear to be working anymore, or if you were taking orthophosphate samples from the MITS liquor as it goes into the clarifier. And if those were high, then it's time to turn up chemical.
All right, thanks. All right, so now we're going to rewind, going to do the review. I lost the chat page here, so I'm not seeing chat comments anymore. And that's just operator error on my part. Rather than belabor that, we'll, oh, there we go. I think I can bring it in that way. There we are. Now I'm back. Okay, so what I'm planning to do is for the next, hour, probably about an hour, I'll run through some nitrogen, phosphorus, and a repeat. Phosphorus last week, I cut it off. We cut it off. It got cut off. We ran out of time before I got everything I wanted to say last week. So I'll do some refreshers on nitrogen fairly quickly, refreshers on phosphorus, and then finish up what I missed last week. And then I think we put a bow on this thing and call it Christmas. Okay, so for nitrogen, we've got two environments. We've got the environment for ammonia conversion to nitrate, call that nitrification. That's an aerobic process, happens in the aeration tank when the air is on. And you can measure that with the ORP. I've got a target I like for nitrification, about a positive 150 for the nitrification. And then once the ammonia is basically gone and you've created nitrate, still a source of nitrogen, it's still a soluble source of nitrogen. To get rid of the nitrate that you just created, you have a low oxygen environment. I like a target of -100 at least to begin with, and then you refine that target based on your experience. And so that'd be a fairly high BOD and low oxygen environment. So ammonia removal looks something like this. Start out with ammonia, and then all these H's get exchanged for oxygens. All the hydrogens go into solution. That's what chews up the alkalinity. If there's not enough alkalinity, we'll actually drop the pH. Otherwise, my analogy, it melts the ice cubes, gets rid of the buffering capacity, if that strong buffering capacity exists. Requires a lot of oxygen. Then the nitrates that get produced in that aeration mode during nitrification, so you're denitrifying, converts nitrogen gas. Nitrogen gas bubbles out of the wastewater, goes to the atmosphere. The atmosphere is 3/4 nitrogen, not polluting, it's going home. Requires BOD. Often BOD is a limiting ability to drive nitrate removal. That's the bad news. The good news is this, when you implement nitrate removal, if you were not removing nitrate before, you were removing ammonia and kind of stopping there. Now you're going to start removing BOD with all that extra oxygen you put in to create the nitrate. The organism is going to breathe that, and that's going to reduce your overall electric demand in most all cases. Doesn't really put oxygen into solution, it puts it to use. And then it also brings back some of the buffering. Now, I mentioned, I think, in my phosphorus discussion that the organisms that denitrify, they're not very fussy eaters. They're kind of brutes, so they outcompete the phosphorus organisms, and they'll eat most any form of BOD, soluble BOD, but they prefer the volatile fatty acids, the candy that the phosphorus organisms, the one and only thing they'll eat. So if there's a lot of nitrates and if there are not a lot of that candy, that volatile fatty acids being produced in septic conditions, phosphorus removal isn't going to work too well. Those VFAs are going to be consumed by the denitrifiers. So here's some rules of thumb. that I have for the 2 steps. And as always, my advice is you got to start somewhere. And so these are recommended as initial targets. And then once with your experience, you may find that your plant removes ammonia quite well at an ORP of positive 100. Then you just refine that number, or your SRT is a different number other than 10 days. So you just start, you got to start somewhere as you're working your way through these things, and then refine your targets. And then of course, then the weather changes, and then you have some seasonality differences as well. I mentioned a couple things during the presentation last week, kind of popped up, but I wasn't able to take them to the finish line. One of them was a little benchtop test to determine I'm not getting the nitrate removal. Is that because I need more time with that low dissolved oxygen, or do I need more BOD? So I just wanted to run through this little simple test, and anybody who wants more on it, Nick or I can send you an email with a Word document that has the test. But the test goes like this. I'm trying to find the answer to this question. I'm not getting the nitrate removal I want. Let's say it's 10. The nitrate's coming out at 10, and I'd really like it to be half of that. What's my solution? Do I need more time in anoxic conditions? Do I need more anoxic conditions? Does it need to be more septic? Or do I need more BOD? So here's the idea. You take some mixed liquor from your anoxic zone and you fill up a settleometer. Then you take another settleometer and you fill it up 2/3, 3/4 of the way full with the same mixed liquor taken out of your anoxic zone, and then top it off with some influent. The BOD, and there's BOD in the influence, the idea. So we're giving this one a BOD boost. Then you measure, and you can mix it up. And when you're mixing it, you're kind of gentle with it, because we don't want to entrain air, right? We're trying to keep the air out. So you mix it up, and then you create a little chart, and you write down what's the nitrate concentration. And I tell you, you can use test strips to do this at the start. Well, the start, they're going to be different, right? Because this nitrate's going to be higher than this nitrate, because raw wastewater has almost no nitrates. So that bit of influent you put in there is going to dilute the nitrate concentration. So we don't really want to compare the numbers from one to the other. We want to compare what happens inside each settleometer. So we're going to write the numbers down at the start. And then after 15 minutes, after we write the number down, we gently stir them and maybe use one of those paddles that comes with a lot of the settleometers, just enough to kind of keep from having a clear layer at the top. And then after 15, 30, 45 minutes, just write the numbers down. So if the numbers look something like this in this tank, or this settleometer, well, that shows that after 15 minutes, well, from 30 minutes on, got a big drop. So if you do this test and you get a big drop like that, that tells you something, right? It tells you that I need more time to remove the nitrates. Now, if you do the test and you get, there we go, that's what it tells you. If you do the test and over here, it doesn't really change that much, but the one with the influent mixed in, after a bit of time, it drops right off. Well, that's going to tell you what? It tells you that more BODs will really help you with the nitrate removal. Now, it may not tell you how to get the BOD, but at least you've identified the problem. And so then you can look for opportunities to increase the BOD. Pretty simple test, takes a couple hours. Like I said, the test strips probably give you close enough numbers so you can do that all in-house. Anybody's interested in that test, let Nick or me know, and we'll get you a write-up on how you can do that. I'm going to jump now to phosphorus unless there's any questions or comments anybody has about nitrogen. If there is or are, whatever the right word there is, type it in and we'll see what we can do.
And Grant, I don't see anything yet on that. So
Okay. Thank you, Nick. I'm kind of watching it too, but it may get in the way of my slides. I may have to get rid of it, but thank you. Interrupt anytime if something comes in.
okay.
Thank you. Phosphorus. So 3 steps in phosphorus removal, right? This is a recap here. First thing is you got to make the food source that the phosphorus removing organisms need to eat. And it's called volatile fatty acids, and they're produced in septic conditions. Good news is pretty easy. You just make things septic. If you live out in the country and you have a septic tank, in your septic tank, you're creating volatile fatty acids. So it doesn't take a lot of energy. The organisms that do that are not related to the rest of the phosphorus removal. They're producing the food source. And the second thing is we get those volatile fatty acids into the mouths of the right organisms. Well, they don't have mouths, but into the right, available to the right organisms. So the phosphate accumulating organisms, the microbes that remove phosphorus biologically under septic conditions, if you put some mixed liquor in there, they will feed on the volatile fatty acids. Now, as I mentioned in the nitrogen summary, if there are nitrates in the wastewater, the organisms that remove nitrate love volatile fatty acids, and they will outcompete the phosphorus organisms. So there's a little bit of a struggle there. Some plants, you kind of make a choice which way you're going, and you try to block the nitrate removal organisms. I think for most plants not designed for phosphorus removal, we're probably going to try to work our phosphorus removal out of the mainstream. So we're going to work around this problem. But if there's a limited amount of volatile fatty acids, and if there's still a 6 milligram per liter, 7 milligram per liter concentration of nitrates, the organisms that will reduce those nitrates down to lower numbers will outcompete the phosphorus organisms. So that's pretty critical here. The third step is once you've energized, they're not growing, and in fact, they're releasing phosphorus in the solution into that second step as they feed on the phosphorus. As they feed on the volatile fatty acids. The phosphorus that's in your raw wastewater actually gets removed in the aeration basin. That plus the phosphorus that just got released while these critters were getting energized. So in the aeration basin with a pH of 6.8 or higher, enough oxygen to remove ammonia, you should have a good environment as long as there's a little bit of BOD still coming into that aeration basin to support biological growth. And I want to come back to that point, so I'm going to make a note on that. Pretty interesting finding in Iowa that I want to share with you at a treatment plant, Charles City. Okay, so back to my favorite ORV chart. I should be paying a commission to YSI. I've been using this chart for years. For phosphorus removal, we're starting at the other end. We're starting way below any kind of detectable dissolved oxygen. If you have a DO meter, it's pegged out. Not at the top end, at the bottom end, it's at 0. And so we want septic conditions. I like to see that minus 200 right there. That's my initial target. Call that fermentation. So we're not quite anaerobically digesting. If we're anaerobically digesting, those volatile fatty acids get broken down into methane gas. And of course, if you get rid of the volatile fatty acids by breaking them down to methane gas in an anaerobic digester, they're not available for the PAOs, the bio-P-bugs, the phosphorus removing microbes. So we want septic enough conditions to create the volatile fatty acids. And then we want the organisms in the mixed liquor to meet up with the volatile fatty acids, block out the nitrate removing organisms. And this P release, fantastic process control tool. If we've got an isolated tank, a separate fermenter, we can actually monitor the phosphorus, soluble phosphorus going in from the blend of whatever's going in there, influent, return sludge. And then we measure the soluble phosphorus, the orthophosphate, coming out of it. And coming out of it should be almost exactly 3 times what it is coming in. If it's only 2 times, it's probably not septic enough. If it's coming out 4 times as much, it's too septic. So we want to monitor that environment to try to reach those target numbers, the 3 to 1. So we're getting them energized here. We're not removing any phosphorus. In fact, we're releasing it into solution, kind of crazy quirk of nature. Then as the organisms, the mixed liquor, moves into aerobic conditions, phosphorus is now removed. And this is where this chart really shines, in my opinion. So if you've got enough oxygen to remove BOD, you've got enough oxygen to remove phosphorus. Well, that's great, but how do you measure BOD here and now? You don't get the test for a week. If you've got enough oxygen to remove nitrates, or to remove ammonia and produce nitrates, if you've got enough oxygen to remove ammonia and produce nitrates, you've got enough oxygen to support the growth of the phosphorus accumulating organisms. Fantastic test. You do a daily measure of your ammonia, your effluent ammonia, and if it's low, then as long as that pH is 6.8 or higher, your aeration basin is good for phosphorus removal. A little asterisk there of this, as long as there's enough BOD to drive it, which I'm kicking down the road a little bit here. So the engineering communities come up with some strategies for design strategies for building plants provide phosphorus removal. And let's review that. Talked about them last week. Somebody unfortunately had their mic turned on and says, now I'm all confused. So hopefully we'll go through it again and try to get rid of some of that confusion. And if not, that's what the chat page is for. Please, you send a comment and try to clarify this, because it is tricky the first time to really get your head around it. So phosphorus removal. Plants have this anaerobic, so there's mixing, but no addition of dissolved oxygen. Many times, unfortunately, in my opinion, it's preceded by a primary clarifier, which just takes some of the BOD out. So we're looking for a high BOD. For phosphorus removal, the rule of thumb is you want about 25 times as much BOD for every milligram per liter of phosphorus that we're removing. So if we're trying to remove 3 milligrams per liter, we're looking for 75 milligrams per liter of BOD in this anaerobic tank. For nitrogen, it's 5 to 1. So if you got 20 parts of nitrate you're trying to remove, there's about 100 parts of BOD. I just, in my hypothetical here, I added 75 for phosphorus. You know, that's a lot of BOD that's getting removed before we even get to the aeration tank. So often that is the limiting component. And so we got to look for ways to boost that BOD. But back to the anaerobic tank. So what happens here? Certain families of bacteria, I don't know who they are, I don't know what their names are. I'm not particularly interested. I probably should be. But there's families of microbes that will take more complex, that long chain thing that that Nick showed in his detergent slide, that will break down these complex molecules into volatile fatty acids, pretty short chain carbon molecules. So they create these volatile fatty acids. They're soluble. They're in and with the wastewater as these more complicated molecules get broken down. We've got in the mixed liquor, right, comes out of the secondary clarifier in a conventional plant. That return sludge works its way back into the anaerobic tank. In and with the mixed liquor are these phosphorus removing organisms. They're a percentage of the mixed liquor. As the phosphorus removing organisms, the PAOs, as they enter the anaerobic tank in septic conditions, they'll feed on the volatile fatty acids. They'll become energized. They don't grow, but they're fed, and there's a metabolic process that puts some phosphorus back into solution. So if you measure the phosphorus of the blend here, the soluble phosphorus, the orthophosphate, and you measure the soluble phosphorus leaving this, if it's about 3 to 1, then you know you've got the volatile fatty acids that are being produced, and the organisms that feed on them are there and are feeding on them and becoming energized. That would mean that this is a very viable environment. Those energized organisms, along with that phosphorus they released, along with the phosphorus that's in the influent in the first place, with enough buttons pushed here, they find their way over into the aeration tank under aerobic conditions, good enough to remove ammonia, as long as that pH is at least 6.8. The phosphorus accumulating organisms will grow. They don't grow so much as they just multiply. So where there was 1, there's now 2. Where there was 10 million, there's now 20 million. And as they multiply, they pull phosphorus out of solution. Where does the phosphorus go? It goes inside the little cells of the microorganisms. So now, instead of being in the water, it's inside the body. So these little wee creatures that you can only see under a microscope, if that. So the mixed liquor now has a higher percentage of phosphorus in it. That mixed liquor goes in the secondary clarifier. Of course, it settles out. The clean water goes out into the receiving water, and the settled sludge, most of it goes back as a return sludge, but part of it goes out as waste sludge. And that's where the phosphorus goes. The phosphorus leaves the plant as waste sludge. It's in the sludge that's hauled off site, however it's taken off site. Meanwhile, some of the organisms are returned back to the anaerobic tank, and they're ready to do another lap. They're ready to feed on some volatile fatty acids, get energized, and multiply again. That's the design concept. That's how tanks are created to provide the environments that support those 3 steps I talked about. If there's any questions or comments on that, now's a great time to put them out there. Because I'm just going to get further in the weeds here.
Yeah, I'm still not seeing any, so
That's okay.
continue onward to the weeds.
Continuing onward. So optimizing this. Couple environments we're looking for. Again, just like the nitrogen, these are rules of thumb. These are a good place to start. You may find, oh, there's a plant here in Connecticut that runs just fine at an ORP of minus 400. It can go very low, the ORP in your anaerobic tank, unless there's a lot of sulfur, and then it starts to smell bad. Not a lot of fear of an anaerobic tank becoming so anaerobic that you're creating methane. That really only happens to a significant degree if the vessel is covered and there's no interaction with the atmosphere. Rules of thumb, I put pH of 7. It's nice to have a little buffer room there, a little comfort room. Buffer is a bad word to use there. A little extra room, because that 6.8 is so critical. It goes to 6.75 and you lose it. So good place to start. And this is pretty interesting here. There's a plant in Tennessee, I might have mentioned it, Athens, Tennessee oxidation ditch, that during the summer months, the phosphorus coming out of the oxidation ditch, the soluble phosphorus is non-detect. I mean, it's below 0.05, 0.02, 0.2, 0.02. It gets really low. Yet the phosphorus coming out of the final effluent is much higher. So when it's really dialed in, the soluble phosphorus coming out of the aeration tank can be real low. Then we would want to watch for a re-release. Some of the phosphorus that you've already removed, got it inside the sludge, something happens that they're now releasing it. We want to protect against that. All right, so
Grant, we do have a comment from Dan Zeller, although maybe that's Dustin Coles. Hi, Dustin. He says that remind everyone that if waste sludge is sent to anaerobic digester, your problems will come back to you and your solids processing filtrate.
That's great advice. And, you know, I don't need to remind them because you just did. And thank you for that. So the folks at Topeka there, if you have an anaerobic digester that's going to break down compounds, the sludge, and as it decays, the cells open up and they release phosphorus. And in an anaerobic digester, you're going to get maybe 50, 60, 80, 100, 120 milligrams per liter of phosphorus in that supernate, and even maybe in your pressate from your sludge. It can be an awful lot of phosphorus. So that's a great comment. And as you're finding and fixing poor phosphorus removal, understanding your sludge processing and your side streams is very important. In fact, I think, Nick, one of the possibilities probably for plants is to look to, if there's chemical addition, would be on these side stream waste to kind of big bang for the buck, tie up some phosphorus in some of those. Good comment. Anything else? No. Okay.
No.
We're doing great. We're way ahead of schedule here, so I may have to pull out the juggling balls here and do some juggling. Main thing to do is, once you understand what's supposed to happen where, I really highly recommend this. I've known a few plants that follow this. They do a weekly profile. you know, if you're in advance of strict limits and you've got a lot of comfort, do it monthly, but get some data on what's the phosphorus coming into the plant, what's the phosphorus coming into this anaerobic zone. So these are soluble phosphorus. So I'm looking to get information on the soluble fraction of phosphorus. That's the part that we as operators manage, is trying to get that phosphorus out of solution into the mixed liquor, either chemically, like Nick talked about at the opening, or biologically. It's still in the mixed liquor. If it's in the mixed liquor chemically, it's in there a little better, a little stronger. It's more resistant to being re-released. It still can be, but it's more resistant to it. If it's being put into the organisms, sometimes it holds it in there pretty well. The organisms in other situations, they're happy to re-release it if the solids settle somewhere for too long. So we're going to want to monitor with some regularity, and we keep this data as a historical, we archive it so that when things go a little wonky, we can see what the concentrations were through the plant when things were working well. And that'll help us focus on the right spot. That's a lot of the problem with phosphorus removal, is if the phosphorus removal is going bad, is it because the anaerobic tank's not working well, the aeration tank's not working well, or is it because it's re-releasing somewhere down? So we need some data. So let me get through this, and then I see a comment came in, and I'll jump on that. So I want to know the phosphorus coming in, phosphorus leaving the primary, the phosphorus going into this blend in the anaerobic tank, coming out of the anaerobic tank, coming out of the aeration tank. This should be our lowest number right here. And if the downstream is ideal, this lowest number will be maintained all the way through the effluent. But it's not unusual for this number to be a little bit higher. There'll be a little bit of phosphorus release in the sludge blanket. So what's that mean? If this number starts to go a lot higher relative to this number, it means we're getting re-release of phosphorus somewhere between that point and this point, probably in a sludge blanket. If it's possible, let's lower that sludge blanket. Nick talked about adding chemicals in distribution boxes because of the turbulence. There's also often dead spots in some distribution boxes. If there's dead spots, solids are going to accumulate there, and any solids that accumulate downstream of the aeration tank that release phosphorus, any solids that accumulate in dead spots downstream of the aeration tank have the potential of releasing phosphorus, which will then flow all the way into the receiving water. So those facilities with real low limits are scrupulous about making sure there's no dead spots post aeration. So we monitor the phosphorus through the plant, including into the sludge storage tank. So the question here, let me play around with my pointer and get it so I can read it. Is there a recommended return rate of the fermented sludge? Is it guess or by golly, pending the strength of the sludge? Boy, that is the perfect segue to my next slide. So let's see if I can get it here. So last week there was a question, and maybe it was the same questioner. How much VFAs do you need to satisfy the phosphorus accumulating organisms? And I did some research, and then I did a little math, and the answer I got was you need about two pounds of VFAs for every pound of orthophosphate. So it isn't by gosh or by golly, but how you get that to get to that number is a lot more experimental than not. So if you have a side stream fermenter and that's creating volatile fatty acids, and you're pumping volatile fatty acids into the anaerobic tank to feed the phosphorus accumulating organisms. You need, and unfortunately it's in pounds, it's not in milligrams per liter, you need twice as many pounds of phosphorus of VFA, excuse me, twice as many pounds of VFAs coming in as there are pounds of phosphorus entering. Now you can do constant, of course, you're going to measure this concentration, but then you got, the plant flow versus the gallons per minute coming out of the fermenter, excuse me. So that'll give you your pounds to pounds. So there is a recommended return rate in pounds, and you want at least twice as many pounds of VFAs. Now, of course, if you have nitrate or nitrates and the denitrifiers are consuming your volatile fatty acids, you need enough to satisfy them plus 2 times. Hopefully that answers the question. All right. So how then, that's all nice and good and well, but I would guess that half the people listening or more work at plants that are not designed to remove phosphorus. So what to do? Well, Nick's come to most of your plants and told you what the cost of removing phosphorus chemically is, not including the cost of buying the chemical removing equipment and getting rid of that extra sludge you produce. But even without that, most everyone found that to be kind of a scary number. So let's see what we can do. Of course, the other thing is you have a facility upgrade to remove the phosphorus, and that may ultimately be required regardless of what you do. But we found a lot of folks can make a lot of headway, and particularly in plants that are running under their design capacity. With the way Kansas's KDHE is going to be writing the permits, they're going to be pounds per day based on capacity, the design flow. I think a lot of you are going to have opportunities, and we've seen a number that already are meeting their limits by being a little creative with their phosphorus removal. So my favorite strategy when, of course, if you have multiple tanks and you can make your plant look like one of those that I showed that's designed for phosphorus removal, great, go for it. But most don't. Most have an aeration tank that can't be divided into an anaerobic zone. And so I want to give you an idea on creating your own side stream fermenter. Plants that are designed for phosphorus removal typically will use primary sludge, let it sit in septic conditions. As it does, creates the volatile fatty acids. That was in my prior illustration. And in those cases, they just pump the supernate, which is rich in volatile fatty acids, into that anaerobic basin to provide the volatile fatty acids. Many plants don't have primary clarifiers, and many plants don't have an ability to create an anaerobic tank. And all of a sudden my mouse is getting I just changed the battery, getting very herky-jerky here. So I apologize. So I'm going to look over here. And why I like this is if I've got an aerobic digester, not an anaerobic digester, an aerobic digester, or if I simply have some tank that I'm doing sludge storage, maybe I'm storing it for a period of time before I can land apply it. Well, if I'm doing that, then I've got waste sludge in there. Waste sludge is the same thing that was in the aeration tank. So it's got the same kind of population blend. They're just old and cranky because I've I've taken out of the action and not feeding them anymore. So I want to turn that into a fermenter. How do I do that? I cycle the air on and off. Maybe you're already doing that with your aerobic digester if you have one. So during the air on cycles, probably making it aerobic enough to get aerobic breakdown in your sludge. And during the air off, if your air is off for more than a couple hours, you can be pretty sure that, and it's not being mixed, you can be pretty sure that down in the bottom of that aerobic digester with the air off, it ain't aerobic no more. It's septic enough that you could actually be creating volatile fatty acids. So we want to manage that a little bit so that instead of guessing that way, we want to run the air off enough consecutive minutes every day so that the bottom foot or so of that aerobic digester drops to an ORP of minus 200. It goes septic enough to create the volatile fatty acids. Turn the air off long enough. Let it go septic enough. There's going to be critters in there that are going to break down the materials in the waste, in the sludge, and make it into volatile fatty acids. Well, there's a whole heck of a lot of organisms in there otherwise. So there will be, with time, if we develop a population of organisms, the PAOs, the phosphorus removing organisms, and they will chow down on some of those volatile fatty acids, become energized. That was pretty easy. The problem now is getting them back from here, wherever there we are, from the fermenter to the aeration tank. And in most plants, frankly, that with a little sleuthing, there's some kind of a drain line or some kind of a manhole that a certain amount of sludge can be sent back and find its way into the aeration tank. It might go through preliminary treatment. If it would settle out in a primary clarifier, that would be a problem. But if you don't have a primary clarifier, you could actually put it in some kind of plant drain that goes back to the head. So we're going to want to take daily, we're going to turn the air off. I'm saying for 6 hours, consecutive hours, drop that into septic conditions. Also daily, we want to turn the air on long enough to bring it up, to bring the ORP up to about 0. And honestly, I haven't tested that number real well, but what I do know is if you've got too many days of storage in this fermenter and you don't aerate it at all, then it's going to get too septic and you're going to be releasing way too much phosphorus. So you can use that 3-to-1 rule, monitor the phosphorus coming out of here. But what we, in this case, instead of just feeding the volatile fatty acids into the mainstream of the treatment plant, we want to feed the energized critters. So we want to pump out of or drain out of this fermenter mixed sludge so that it has the energized creatures. We don't want to supernate. We want the energized organism. If we're going to supernate, let's supernate, but let's keep going until we get some, also send some organisms back. In an ideal world, we do it daily. In a super ideal world, it's constant. But as frequently as you can, maybe 3 days a week, if you have to do it manually until you can get this automated. But you'll see that you can create the volatile fatty acids in the fermenter. That's pretty easy. Can energize the organisms. That's pretty easy. keep them in that window, that 3-to-1. That's maybe not so easy. That may take a little time to figure that out. And then my rule of thumb, start out with maybe around 10% of what you daily waste as waste sludge. Bring that amount back in. That'll give you enough energized phosphorus removing organisms that when they hit the aeration tank, provided, right, that the aeration tank has the conditions to remove ammonia, then you should be getting good phosphorus removal in the aeration tank as well. That's kind of where I am with a whole wrap up with a summary of the nitrogen and phosphorus. So if there's any questions or comments, it'd be fabulous. Because I'm kind of at the end of my presentation. That went a lot faster than I thought it would. Any questions or comments? Nitrogen, phosphorus, side stream, mainstream, chemical, biological? If not, I'm going to give this back to Nick. And then I think Ryan Eldridge of KDHE would like to make some closing comments. So Nick, are you there? Would you like to take it over?
I am here. Okay, yeah, thanks, Grant. So from our surveys and outreach earlier in the webinars, it does sound like there is a desire for people with oxidation ditches to participate in nutrient removal cohorts. We tried to classify these technology by treatment plant technology. And that's what we had the takers for. I know there are a couple facilities who'd like to be a part of a cohort that there aren't peer facilities for, so we'll try to work on it. If you do know the peers and they may not be part of this, feel free to reach out to them. We can try and take this on after this webinar series and, you know, sometime in the first or second quarter of next year. As far as CEUs, I'm going to try and turn in all of the CEUs by the end of today. Like I said, I've already turned in the CEUs from the first two webinars, and I feel pretty solid about the third. I did reach out to the city of Coffeyville for some clarification. So if you can send me an email either now or shortly after, that would be helpful. But I think everybody else is logged appropriately. I don't know the time frame for when these show up on the portal. Somebody was telling me there was something with a new portal for checking your hours. I don't know anything about that. If Ryan does, maybe he can address that when he hops on. Again, I do want to extend you know, and kind of open invitation for on-site assistance. I can get out to your plant typically within a month of being asked. I do have loaner equipment available. So a lot of the process control testing that we were talking about, if you do not have that equipment, you can borrow ours for a while. We provide reagents as well. So you would be able to have a digital readout for ammonia, orthophosphate, and nitrates. Additionally, that ORP measurement that Grant kept talking about and the importance of ORP, we have some ORP probes and meters that are also available for lending. Right now, I think I have stock of both of them that aren't deployed. And at some point, I have to get them back from facilities at some point in the future. But if you are interested from a nutrient removal point of view, or also like, trying to develop standard operating procedures. So we test ammonia 3 times a week, and you need to show, your management in your community or, city council buy-in to be able to buy some of this equipment. This is a really good opportunity. We're using primarily HANA equipment, and I don't get a commission, but I probably would be better off if I did. I have sold quite a few of these systems the communities have liked them, and then they contacted the company and bought them. So I think it is being successful in that way, that the communities are seeing the value of this equipment, of monitoring the ammonia regularly and some of the other parameters as well. So I very strongly encourage you to take advantage of that. I come out, the equipment's at no cost, the reagents are at no cost to you. So it's only upside on that side. We did have a couple more questions here. So I might ask Grant to hop on, and I'll take care of a couple of them. So the first question, Grant, is
The ORP one?
yeah.
Yeah, let me jump on that. That's a great question. And you kind of kick it back at people to think about. So ORP measures how actively organisms are using oxygen. Positive numbers is how actively they're, let's say, breathing free dissolved oxygen. The negative numbers is how hard they're working to break molecular bonds to, again, I'll use the word breathe, to breathe bound up oxygen, like off of nitrates. So if you have a significant dissolved oxygen, but a zero ORP, what that means is your plant's dead. It means that the oxygen is being put into the wastewater, but the organisms aren't using it aerobically. So that's the answer, and that's not a place any of us want to be, where we have an aeration basin with an ORP of 0. Either that or your meter's broken, which is what we would hope be the case. But so if a toxin would come into your wastewater, for example, kill your mixed liquor, your DO would actually go up, or your ORP would go down.
Okay. And then Tim wrote, RR, could calibration be off on one or the other?
I don't understand that. RR. Well, maybe that's the response.
That's to Robert Roth.
Okay.
Yeah, so you could have calibration or non-working meter. And like Grant was saying, that would be better. And that's always, you can tell by smell and look if something's really off. So use those senses as well. Okay, I was asked by Angela, what are the ideal reagents for monitoring these processes? So that's a really good question. It depends. So I think Grant and I would both tend to talk about the benefits of having a system that has digital readout to the test. So test strips are cheap. They can be pretty effective. The wastewater industry, if you haven't noticed, is fairly male dominated, and males tend to be the people who are colorblind. And a lot of people aren't really aware of it. So that is one reason that I think a digital readout is good. You may see colors just fine, and there's some kind of cool online tests to figure out if you are colorblind, that you can play around it with. Likewise, some of them are kind of, I'm not colorblind, but I have trouble. Is this a 0.5 or is this a 1.5 with the gradations of some of the color, depending on, if you're in sunlight, if you're in fluorescent light inside the lab. So definitely a digital readout. I would also encourage looking for a spectrophotometer, a photometer that can do the tests that you need and those that you might find interesting some reason, and also that can do tests that are like the reagents work and report within the range that you expect to see at your plant. So ammonia, the coming out of your clarifier hopefully is under 5 most times. So 0 to 5 would be good for that. But if you need to test influent ammonia, and you get high inflow pneumonia, you'd want a range that goes up to maybe 50 or 60. And I think the reason for that is just to eliminate friction that would keep operators from doing that process control testing. If there's one more step to it, then you know, it might not get done when things go haywire at the plant otherwise. So try to avoid dilution if you can. Dilution also just is another place for human error to come in. So if you have a test that is within the range you would expect, that's probably the better one. I have not seen a whole lot of cost difference between the different companies on a per test basis. I don't know, Grant, if you have any more insight on that or anything more to add on that.
Yeah, the thing I'd like to say is, and it's so easy for Nick and me to say this, but I mean, look at the relative cost of a facility upgrade. This is what we're trying to optimize the treatment plant so that we can minimize that capital outlay. And that capital outlay, if it's $100,000, it's incredibly inexpensive. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands to millions. And I find myself, and I'm really glad to hear what Nick just said, because I find myself working towards this $1.50 test strips, you know, buying for 30 something bucks a container. Get good equipment, spend thousands of dollars, and trying to save millions. And I know it's hard to get it through to get your community, but oh my gosh, having a good control. And then the other part of it, and Nick was just, I think, getting into it, is with the dilution. Make it easy, because if it's hard for you to get the results, you got to spend an hour doing crazy stuff, then you're not going to get it done. So it needs to be easy, reliable, and that means probably more money than anybody would want to spend, but it's far less than the alternative. So if there's anything Nick or I can do to help push that, I've written letters on company letterhead. I don't know what Nick can do in Wichita State, but he can certainly loan you equipment, and then we can always follow up and support you, because it's pennies on the dollar getting good equipment. Back to you, Nick.
Well, let's see.
I see you've given your contact information.
Yeah, and that'll be on a future slide.
Right.
I think if Ryan's available, it'd be a good
Yeah.
time to turn it over to him.
All right, yeah, thanks, Nick. So yeah, first I just want to thank you, both Nick and Grant, and WSU people in the background for putting this together. I think it's great information. This stuff is not easy, and I think it takes repetitive, listening to these and stuff like that to truly understand it. Especially the phosphorus side, which is not as intuitive as nitrogen. Second, I want to thank all the attendees. I believe through most of these webinars we had 60, 70 plus people attending, which is great. And I'll reiterate kind of what Nick and Grant said. Take advantage of both Nick on site, Grant remotely. KDHE is paying for this. We support these efforts and optimization, and I think it definitely helps you guys operators be more engaged in running your plants and stuff like that. Like Grant and Nick just said, process control is key. And I know when I've gone to a lot of plants and stuff like that, most of the time you guys are just using your information from your monthly lab reports, which really doesn't tell you much. So, take advantage of Nick using that loaner equipment to kind of sell your city council board and stuff like that for, purchasing it long term. And like Grant said, that it's pennies on the dollar to get some of this equipment and even if you eventually do upgrade your plant, having that information and being able to use that equipment beforehand is definitely huge. And understanding that information, especially if you would get a new plant designed for biological nutrient removal. I encourage those cohorts, definitely get operators in the room talking to each other. I think that's the best knowledge share that we can have, and we've been pretty siloed. So I glad to hear that oxidation dish is one. I'd like to see some of the aeromod plants. I don't know how many are on this call, but I know we have a bunch of those across the state. So it'd be great to start one of those as well. And then just any other treatment technologies kind of outside of that, maybe me, Grant, and Nick can hold more of a general kind of one for just, you know, DNR in general. So as far as CEUs, those should be getting entered into our new software cert tracker. That's outside my area, so I don't know for sure when they're going to be updated in there, but I know Nick has sent them to them, so that's where they will be going. But other than that, I just, you know, kind of definitely reiterate Nick and Grant, you know, definitely take advantage of them. It's free help, you know, that's the best price you guys are going to get. So definitely take advantage of it, especially with KDHE paying for it. And, you know, like I said, we encourage this, and we definitely want to be on your side. And we know that, you know, these limits that we put on you are definitely not always easy, but that's why we're doing this, to, you know, help you guys meet those limits in a low cost fashion.
All right, I think we're going to end up probably ending this one a few minutes early, and that's fine. Like everyone said, I'm glad you've taken advantage of this. Grant is saying, let me say something, looks like.
Yeah, I got one more.
Okay.
I wrote the note and I didn't get back to it. So I just wanted to close the loop. So I was talking about in the aeration tank for phosphorus removal, there can be an issue of not enough BOD. And I just wanted to tell a short story in Iowa. So earlier this week, had a follow-up call after visiting some Iowa plants. And one of the fellows in Charles City had that anaerobic zone, anoxic zone, and then a huge oxidation ditch. He measured the soluble BOD. So he took the flow coming out of the anaerobic zone, the anoxic zone, the flow going into the aerobic zone. He filtered the mixed liquor. The BOD was 5 and 8. He did 2 different samples. The BOD was gone in his treatment plant before it got to aeration. Incredible. So I'm running with an operating theory that sometimes for phosphorus removal, all the conditions are ideal and you're not getting phosphorus removal, there is the possibility that all the BOD, and this would be, there's some Kansas plants that have anaerobic and anoxic zones. It's possible that the BOD depletion is so complete that by the time the wastewater gets in the aeration tank, you're going to get ammonia removal, because ammonia removal does not require BOD, but you're not going to get growing of the cells to remove phosphorus. So how to fix that, I'm not sure. We want to detune that equipment up front so that some of that BOD slips in. So the profiles will be helpful in seeing where things are going through your plant. And I've seen it, and this is like 3, maybe 5 cases. I think I know of 3. It could be 5 cases of the 200 plants I've been to where there's so much BOD removed that by the time it gets to aeration, I just don't think there's enough there to build new cells. So that can shut down phosphorus, just to further complicate things. Okay, back to Nick, wrap it up. There's our contact information. I don't know about Nick, I'm sure it's true. This was tremendous. I really enjoyed this series. Thank you, Nick, for all you did, Ryan, and of course, all the participants. This is great. Nick, back to you.
Yeah, I don't have any grand closing thoughts, so I'll just say thank you and goodbye. Grant and I will stay on for a few minutes here, but we'll be turning CEUs in for this and last week's webinar here. So yeah, thanks, and please again do not hesitate to contact either of us.